Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Faye Flam, who is a journalist at Bloomberg, or should I say Bloomberg.com? Is that how they like to be known nowadays?
I don't know. I think Bloomberg's fine. I guess it is mostly like everything else online.
Yeah, but also you've worked at a bunch of other periodicals, including Science, and of course the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is where you were when you wrote this book called "The Score: How the Quest for Sex Has Shaped the Modern Man," and that's, I guess, it's lessons from the sex column you wrote. I think your journalism has expanded far beyond things related to sex. And in fact, when I was going back and reading all of your pieces for the last 10 years or so online, I realized that I had read many of them before, but I guess I don't pay enough attention to bylines. And I guess that's sort of in the internet age, bylines kind of get buried unless you're sucking people into your Patreon or some kind of a website. But I wanted to talk to you about the role of science journalism, because it seems like people get their sense of what's true and false about the world from a variety of sources. And we have academics, of course, who publish in academic journals and also Nature and Science and so forth. We have public health officials, and you've written quite a bit on public health, on diet and COVID and so forth. And then we have journalists. And, to be a science journalist in some ways is just to translate what the scientists say and kind of make it comprehensible. And that's what a lot of science news is about. The New Scientist, a lot of those periodicals. But then there's another job that science journalists have, which is to sort of evaluate the output of the scientists, kind of when there seems to be contradictions, figure out, which positions are more accurate or more supported by data, and then ultimately to critique a lot of the work. And so, do we need these kinds of checks and balances in order to make sure that we are arriving at coherent understanding of the world?
I think so. When I started out, I actually was in physical sciences. Before I was at the Philadelphia Inquirer, I was at Science Magazine, and my beat was physics and astronomy. And so the sex thing was more of a deviation than really anything to do with where I started. But I think when I was covering those fields, of course, it was really important for me to try to translate what was going on in these fairly arcane fields with a lot of jargon and concepts that weren't necessarily familiar to people. But there were also a lot of situations where the scientists disagreed with each other. And so my job would be to talk to people on different sides, find out why they disagreed, where some of the unknowns were, where some of the disagreement was really either about data or about how to interpret that data, or about personality conflicts, and to try to sort of get to the bottom of things. So a lot of the feature stories I wrote for them and for the Philadelphia Inquirer were really to try to get a sense of, the lay of the land in different fields, and to put new findings that were being promoted into a bigger context of, whole fields that were trying to answer certain kinds of questions.
Yeah, I think of my job as a teaching academic to be very similar to that. You have to get up in front of a class and you have to say, this is what the state of the art thinking is, right? These are all the different opinions and here's how they differ. And you actually have to kind of put down a stake somewhere and say, I think that this argument is more persuasive than the other. But why don't the scientific communities do that themselves, right? We have peer review. The scientific process is supposed to arrive at consensus. Why do we need outsiders, to the extent that journalists and, teaching academics, maybe even generalists, are considered outsiders?
I think it's to connect what the scientists are doing and what they're talking about to the people that are interested and the people whose tax money is paying for it. I think a lot of the scientists I talk to are, they feel like talking to me and doing interviews with me is part of their duty as scientists who are often paid by public dollars. And there's a lot of curiosity out there. People want to know. They want to know, how the universe will end, and they want to know why scientists think black holes exist, and they want to know how they can detect planets around other stars. They want to know what the Higgs boson really is and why people, spend so much time and effort to identify it. So there's, I think there's a lot of just general interest and curiosity, and I think it's important for people to be able to accurately translate it so that the scientists are happy that the message got out, but that the readers can read something about a fairly difficult field and say, wow, I never knew I could understand something about that topic. And that's what would make me happy, is if I come into the newsroom and colleagues would say, wow, I didn't think I could ever understand that cosmology or particle physics, but now I think I kind of get what they're trying to do.
Yeah, you had a recent article that talked about some junk science. I mean, it's not really junk science. I guess it was sort of these fraudulent publications, right, with AI-generated articles and so forth. And it's kind of amazing to me that stuff like that can exist, right? And of course, there's a whole incentive scheme where academics are supposed to publish stuff. But, I mean, why don't institutions see right through that? Like, it's kind of wild.
It is, and I think something happened, in the early teens, there was what was called the replication crisis was identified, where certain fields had, the bulk of the findings that were in the published literature could not be replicated. So some of that was just, general mistakes on the part, honest errors. Some of it was use of statistics in a way that had seemed okay in those fields, but was actually incorrect. That the statistical arguments were basically wrong, and then there was some intentional fraud. There was sort of a mix of things that led to so many papers being unreproducible. And now it's, if anything, it's gotten worse. I've talked to people who I had interviewed throughout this replication problem, and they say it's worse now. There's more pressure to publish a lot of findings. There are more ways to cheat, and that there's just more, and there are more bad journals. There are a few, gold standard journals, and then there are journals that are sort of in this middle range where they publish all kinds of different things. So there are just a lot of bad papers and bad journals.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, what supports this? I mean, is there just I don't know, research inflation? I mean, is there a lot of fat, you think, in the process? You've got certainly people in Washington now who are cutting the budgets of all sorts of federally funded research endeavors and so forth. I mean, is there a grain of truth in that? I mean, is there sort of a lot of wasted effort in the scientific world?
Not necessarily. One of the somebody I respect a lot gave me a really good argument that people should be able to publish less and fewer papers. So it's not that those scientists should be fired or they shouldn't get grant money. It's that they're publishing too many papers, and that there are times when their work should go into a database, that they've collected data. They don't need to turn it into a new paper, and that they shouldn't be pressured to produce so many papers. That we do have an excess of publication, which doesn't mean we have an excess of research or too many scientists, but that scientists are feeling too much pressure to publish too many incremental findings, or they don't feel like they'll get proper credit or career advancement if they work hard on something that goes into a database rather than a published paper.
Yeah, so it means that a lot of these publications are not really getting scrutinized or reviewed early on.
Oh yeah, that's true.
There are a lot,
and then the peer review process is imperfect. So there are papers that get through, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is that the really splashy papers, the ones that are going to make big headlines, the journals really want those. That's something, and that I worked for Science, which is also a journal, and they were always in competition with Nature, and they were always trying to get these big findings, but they often stumbled when they would publish those. There are a few famous examples of things that just turned out to be overblown or out and out not true.
Well, I mean, if you're in the VC community, the entrepreneurial community, they might say, well, we start all these companies and a lot of these companies fail and no big deal. I mean, should we view the retraction of a journal article as a calamity, or should we just say, well, yeah, I mean, that's part of the process, right? Throw a lot of stuff out there and then it gets scrutinized and then you got to delete a bunch of the stuff and it's the stuff that sticks around that you really, I find it sometimes difficult because I'll be citing an article and usually when the article's published, it makes a big splash, but when it's retracted, that sort of happens with a little bit less fanfare. And so a lot of people kind of go around continuing to, believe this stuff that's no longer supported by the data.
That's true. That's true. There's a great website called Retraction Watch, and they're always writing about people's papers that continue to be cited. I think it really depends on the reason for the retraction. If it's fraud, if it's actual dishonesty, or even if it's a kind of shady use of statistics, then I think that is a problem, and it's not just the natural process of science. And I think people have to maybe rethink the meaning of failure. If you have a hypothesis that's kind of a long shot and you test it and you do a really good experiment and you find out the hypothesis didn't hold up, well, you've tested that. Maybe that's something you can rule out. That should be an acceptable, perfectly normal part of science. It's not a failure per se. It's just sometimes you have to rule something out that's a long shot. If it's some long shot idea for how a disease that we don't understand might start, or it could be almost anything. And so retractions that are for fraud or dishonesty are kind of intolerable. But the rest of it, I think, if it's studies that don't pan out, if they're honest, then there's a positive contribution.
Now, look, you were trained as a scientist. I have a lot of students that are trained as business people. They're not usually scientists. But I always tell them that they should be able to read, interpret, and evaluate papers that are published in academic journals. Is that too high of an expectation for ordinary, say, business people? Shouldn't they be able to sort of take on faith the conclusions of a lot of these scientific journals, or at least shouldn't they have a go-to journalistic resource that can help them weed out the true from the false?
Yeah, there are such resources, and there are places like the American Institute of Physics and the American Chemical Society, places where different fields can, will weigh in on findings. And there are places where you can find, scientists who weigh in on headline findings. And so, every there's a certain amount of hype with new papers and the way they can be spun. And sometimes it's a little hard to interpret the scientific language. So I think sometimes people do need some translation. And there are also big disagreements where scientists on two different camps are, all very respected. That's especially true in things like nutrition. And yet they'll say completely contradictory things.
Yeah, but a lot of the research seems to also be motivated by a desire to achieve a particular result, particularly research that's funded by industry. Is there... you had an article, I think, about doctors and how they were subconsciously influenced, right, by the subsidies that they got from pharmaceutical companies. But are scientific researchers also? Is disclosing conflicts enough to overcome any bias they might have in their research?
I think you have to go into it knowing that individual scientists are going to be biased toward wanting their ideas to be right, and that's always been the case, which is why the science is, it has to be a big group enterprise that's kind of self-correcting in the long run. But that, sometimes it can get off on the wrong track because a particular scientist has a very strong point of view, and then it takes a while for other people to come in. But yeah, I think that you have to assume that people, individuals are going to have biases. They're going to want their idea to be right. They're going to want the conclusion that's going to help their career. How they're human.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a time when a lot of my neighbors had signs on their yard saying that they were in favor of science.
Yes,
And I thought, well, this is kind of strange.
it
Right?
is kind of
It's like,
strange.
I'm in
Yes, because
favor of physics. Like, I mean, who could be opposed to science? But I
yes.
think, there have some people there. I mean, I should say, who would ever admit to being against science? But I think there actually are some people who say, you know what, I'm not really into this science thing because they perceive science as, I don't know, people who at least purport to be scientists as, having some kind of agenda. How did we get there?
I think that has been the case when I was writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer back in the early aughts. There was a sort of a faction on the religious right, and they were against certain areas of science. They did not like anything related to evolution. They thought that God created the world, that's the way it is, and they're not gonna. They either wanted to believe in creation science. There's always somebody that'll come along and say that something that has nothing to do with science is a science.
Yes, but that's saying that I don't oppose science. I just have, my own science.
Exactly,
Right?
and that's what 90% of it is. What people call anti-science is really people saying, "Oh, I love science, but I like these scientists, the ones that wrote this book on intelligent design theory, or I like these scientists, the ones that will tell me why vaccines are actually killing everybody, or that for every unscientific idea, there's some faction of scientists who are backing it, and so there's a lot of pseudoscience because people basically, especially Americans, we love science, right? And so that's why people put those signs up. But the people that want to take a point of view that's not really supported by mainstream science can find some fringe scientists and say, no, I'm following science.
Yeah, but I mean, mainstream science, I mean, the important thing about science is that science is contested and science is provisional. And I think a lot of people, they don't really understand that, right? I mean, they want conclusive output, right? And
Yeah. And
even scientists themselves, right?
yeah, I mean, I remember when I first went from writing for science to writing for a newspaper, that editors would want me to use language like truth and proof, and those were just that's not language I would use when I wrote for when I was really writing about physics so the biologists could understand it, because it was just understood that you didn't have proof beyond a shadow of a doubt for anything. What you had was one theory that would supplant another one because it had better evidence, but it didn't mean it was the end. Newton's theory was pretty good. Einstein's theory explained a lot more things and explained some discrepancies in Newton's theory. Evolution, I mean, Darwinian evolution was better than any explanation anybody else had for all kinds of observations about the living world. So it's, I think it is provisional, and yet, some of the ideas we have are the best ideas that have come along so far. And that's how science progresses. There are a few people, I think, who would disagree, who take a sort of postmodern view that science is just like fashion; it kind of goes around in a circle. I don't subscribe to that view. It is out there.
Well, I mean, there's this John Oliver skit that people send me all the time about, he says, oh, coffee's good for you, coffee's bad for you, and chocolate's good for you, and chocolate's bad for you. And so then, a lot of people just throw up their hands and say, well, you can find an opinion in every direction, so I'm just going to go ahead and do what feels right anyway.
Yeah, well, I do that. I go ahead and drink coffee because I like it, But, and I think especially with health and nutrition, because it is one of those fields that's still finding its way. It's really, really complex to try to figure out. People are omnivores, and they, different groups of people around the world have been healthy, eating diets that are mostly animals and diets that are mostly plants, and all kinds of different things. And so it's pretty difficult to figure out what people should eat, what's good for you, what's things like coffee that are not obviously poisonous. And so, at some point, I think it is reasonable to say, you're going to experiment a little on yourself. Maybe if you're feeling jittery, try giving up coffee. Maybe if you feel better, great. Then maybe coffee isn't for you. And I think it's the same with diets that, I sometimes talk to Gary Taubes, who was a colleague of mine at Science, who subscribes to the ketogenic diet, and it works for him. I wouldn't do it because I don't think I need it, but I could see how it's worth giving it a try. It doesn't mean everybody has to do it.
Yeah, but Gary's also talked about how, consensus, there are consensuses that form and then they become very difficult to dislodge, right? And, he talks specifically about the, low-fat diet.
Yes.
And how this sort of became uniformly endorsed by the medical community at one point, and now I think it's probably universally dismissed by the medical community, but the general public still subscribes to it, and certainly the food marketers, right, subscribe
They still
to
subscribe to it, and there are a few holdouts too who still, believe in the low-fat thing. Yeah, and the reality is it's pretty complex because there are lots of different kinds of fats, and people maybe some people can get away with eating a different kind of diet and not gaining weight and getting sick, and others can't. So it is complicated, but yeah, they really got stuck on that low-fat thing, and I've written about that a bit because I think it is a really interesting case where there was evidence just piling up, and it kind of got ingrained in the medical community that this was just how you could eat. And in some ways, they weren't really thinking about the fact that if you tell people to eat less fat, they're going to have to make it up by eating more of something else. And so somehow by not thinking it through that way, it wasn't that people thought, oh yeah, people should just eat tons of starch and sugar. It's just somehow it didn't seem to occur to them that that's exactly what would happen. If you told them that you can't eat eggs for breakfast, they're going to eat more frosted flakes or pastries.
Yeah, but I mean, what you just described is sort of a logical exercise that, I don't know, I guess we might call common sense, right? So it would seem like, I mean, do you think journalists in general is that their superpower in a way? I mean, do they bring kind of more common sense to the table than someone who might even be much more knowledgeable in a particular domain?
I don't know. I mean, I think that what you can get as a journalist is you can get this really wide-ranging perspective. You can talk to 5 or 6, 7, 8, 10 experts in an area, people with different points of view. You can really listen to them, and so sometimes the experts will be curious what I come up with because they're not going to go to all of these other people and then talk to them the way I will, and ask all these naive questions and kind of get to the bottom of why they think the way they do. So you do get this chance, you have this great privilege to get to go out and really grill lots and lots of people about something and try to kind of, and then go back and forth even and say, well, Dr. A says you're wrong about this, can you explain that? So you can do this great kind of investigation that can be hard for other people to have the time or ability to do.
I mean, you had a recent piece, maybe not so recent, about these decongestants, right? That apparently there's $2 billion worth of these decongestants sold every year, and it's really nothing more than a placebo. And of course, this is just one example. There's plenty of others that would be considered, I guess, food additives or supplements. I mean, it's like a gigantic industry. I mean, how does something like that survive? I mean, because I think a lot of us sort of have this belief that, if this was bogus, like it just wouldn't be allowed, right? So a lot of us don't even do our due diligence. We don't even do the research. We just sort of assume that somebody else is right doing the research.
Yeah, I know. I think people do. There's an assumption that the FDA is sort of protecting us from things that don't work, but they're legally, they have to kind of keep their hands off of supplements, and that's partly the work of Congress telling FDA,
That's Proxmire, right? Didn't Proxmire?
No, wait. Now I'm trying to remember. Yeah, but it was from the Republicans anyway, protecting the supplement industry.
I think the story was, this might be apocryphal, I don't know, but I think Proxmire was from Wisconsin, and Wisconsin had a big it was like the headquarters of a big vitamin company or something.
Okay, yeah, and then there was
So
there was one of them who was also like had some stake in bee pollen or some kind of supplement, and that was the and wanted wanted FDA to stay away from that. There are certain false advertising claims, and you could get in trouble if what you were selling was really toxic. But there is sort of a long history of bad stuff being sold, and I think in the aisles of your CVS, a lot of the over-the-counter stuff hasn't really been vetted all that well. And I asked people, I asked somebody in the pharmaceutical industry, like, well, why wouldn't you just get rid of this stuff? He said, well, people in the know to go to the pharmacist and ask for the real stuff, But because the real stuff, I guess, right, the real stuff, Sudafed,
it's now controlled substance, right?
What was
Pretty
it?
much. It's now like a controlled substance,
Yeah,
right?
it can be. Right. The Breaking Bad crew can turn that into crystal meth. Right. So there were some safety precautions about that they couldn't just put it out on the shelves anymore. But then it does seem to me unethical to put totally useless stuff on the shelves. And then, that was, I think the two pharmacists that I interviewed for that were really champions of getting the useless stuff off the shelves, because it does erode public trust.
Or you could have truth in marketing and just say, this is a placebo.
This is a placebo, right?
If
you think that you're subject to the placebo effect, go ahead and take this stuff. Maybe it'll make you think you're better. I mean, most colds go away on their own, and so it's very subject to, people feel better in a couple of days and think, oh wow, that stuff I took, it really worked.
Yeah, U.S. is a remarkably unhealthy country, given how much we spend on healthcare. Do you think there's a relationship there? Would we be healthier if we spent less on healthcare? Does Robert F. Kennedy Jr. have a point that maybe we should be, redirecting our investment and our intellectual efforts on things like diet and less on sort of, remediation?
Well, he doesn't. He doesn't. For whatever reason, he has sort of pitched infectious disease and chronic disease as two separate things, and is saying, well, we should back off from infectious disease, which I think is a mistake right now. I think we need our infectious disease research community to have funding. I would say that if there's anything where there's an imbalance, it may be that NIH was too focused on the genome under Francis Collins, that everything was about the genome. And when I was writing about biology and medicine back in, around the 2000, they were promising that by now everything would be curable. We'd have a cure for everything because the genome would give us all the answers. And I think that the health effects of the environment maybe deserve a little bit more attention now. Maybe we do need to think about how our environment is making us sick. Genes still play a role, the fact that everyone isn't obese has something to do with differences in our genes. But the fact that so many more people are obese now than 50 years ago is not because our genes changed. So they both, genes and environment are both important, but I could see how he's wrong to pit it against infectious disease, but he's right that people that there should be funding for study of environmental toxins, for microplastics in our environment. That's something I just wrote about. We should learn more about what these are doing to us, and we should understand more about how to eat, what's healthy, what isn't healthy, how to help people eat healthier, especially if they're on a budget.
Yeah, you wrote an article, I think it was like 8 years ago, about the role of big data in healthcare. And, I started teaching courses with a lot of material around big data and healthcare around that time. And it seems like, the promise that was there, we haven't really fully experienced it. I think you said somewhere that medicine is really a discipline around, expertise, and the practitioners kind of guard their expertise, right? And big data is kind of like a way of saying, hey, we can probably automate a lot of this stuff, and we can probably access, high quality expertise without necessarily having an expert in the room.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways that big data has maybe been quietly improving things is with cancer. If you have a cancer diagnosis, that there are people now who get a very, very precise series of treatments for that particular cancer. That 20 years ago, they would just get some chemotherapy thrown at them that was more general purpose. So they are really able to. They can look at the genome of your cancer, and they can look at, exactly what drugs you need. So there is a kind of a gradual increase, I think, in the precision of medicine, at least for some people who can afford that, who are going to the world's best cancer centers.
Yeah, I mean, I recently hurt my back, and I called my doctor and I was like, hey, maybe I should get an MRI. And they're like, they're not going to give me an MRI unless I throw a fit. And I kept wondering why, because the marginal cost of an MRI is actually quite low, but they would need to have a human look at it, and that's the cost, right? But there's no real reason why you should need a human to make an initial screen. You should be able to just upload it to the cloud and have the cloud say, yeah, nothing wrong here, maybe something wrong here, I don't know. And then maybe it gets passed on to a human if there's some alarm bells that go off. So I still kind of find it puzzling why these big healthcare institutions haven't figured out ways to automate things, simplify things, and become a little bit more like, other sectors.
That's a good question. I think there's a certain amount of inertia and tradition in medicine, and then there's sort of cost barriers. It's hard to say with all these advances in AI whether we'll see things in a couple of years that we'll finally start to see all these promised breakthroughs.
Now, you started a podcast. I guess it's kind of on hiatus, but you had some wonderful episodes in there. And I think you were motivated, by the pandemic to start this podcast. And, when I started my podcast, I thought, oh, maybe I should just focus on the pandemic for the first couple episodes, because it did seem like there was a strong demand for scientific expertise. But the supply of varying opinions almost outran the demand for these opinions. I mean, did the pandemic have lasting negative consequences in terms of how people view public health and scientific authority?
It's hard to know whether the pandemic, we certainly are, I think, more polarized, more divided, and a lot of those issues have become politicized since the pandemic. Whether that was already started pre-pandemic because of all of our division over Donald Trump being president, or whether the pandemic really catalyzed it, I'm not sure. But I'd say those things sort of fed off each other, because we were already becoming really divided during Trump's first presidency. And that's when we saw those signs, and basically if you put a sign outside saying, I believe in science, the hidden message there is my neighbor over there who has a Trump sign doesn't believe in science. The implication is those other people are idiots who don't believe in science. And I think
the divide seemed rather arbitrary, right? I mean, it could have just as easily gone the other way. So
it could have. This is what's so interesting. The pandemic was during the early months, like the early weeks of the pandemic, things were going back and forth in a way, if you were following it really closely, that were almost arbitrary. So in the very beginning, like by late January of 2020, it was already pretty clear this thing was going to go everywhere, because it was going everywhere in China. It was going everywhere. It was going to other Asian countries. It was a highly transmissible virus. This wasn't like SARS-1, which affected a few people and they were able to contain it. This was going to be big. And there were people, I think, on the political left who were saying, oh, we're not going to make a big deal out of this. We're going to downplay this because that, Trump is calling it the Kung flu, and, kind of making these anti-China statements about it. And if Trump is doing that, we're going to go the opposite. And so there were actually editorials in the big newspapers saying, the flu is worse than COVID. Like, be more worried about flu, And I would see these things, they're wrong. They shouldn't be, they're going the wrong direction. And then at some point, Trump sort of flipped and said, we're it's going to go away. I mean, Trump was he was fairly inconsistent, and he would jump around. And I felt like for a while that what was considered acceptable on the political left was jumping around to try to be opposite to Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to some folks who said that public health officials started with the outcome that they were looking for, and then they looked at their communications as being instrumental. And some people have said that meant that they had a relatively low opinion of people's capacity to understand public health information. I mean, is there truth in that? I mean, not just truth in the accusation that they did that, but also, I mean, is there truth that perhaps the general public can't really understand, these complex things, and needs to have a simplified and perhaps maybe even less than perfectly accurate depiction of things presented to them?
I think people can understand. I think if it's presented clearly, they can understand things that are pretty complex. And I think sometimes the oversimplifications were, that the truth wouldn't have been that complicated. And there's a guy I really liked talking to during the pandemic, Peter Sandman, who's an expert in risk communication. And he said, their profession was not consulted, but should have been. That risk communication experts should have been, it should have been on the front lines, really, going in between the messengers and the public, and that their philosophy is that the truth is better in the long run, that it just doesn't pay in the long run to oversimplify things to the point that they're not true. And so I think that honesty is generally the best long-term policy, and there were people out there in the public health world who had that philosophy from the beginning, and I think that they maintained their respect because you look back at everything they said and it was correct.
Well, I think also journalists have been accused of chasing after, clicks and sales, and sometimes that means appealing to the political impulses of their readers. I mean, do you think science journalists are sort of less immune to that than non-science journalists? I mean, a lot of the coverage of COVID was on the front page, not in the science pages, right? So it was kind of news journalists that were trying to pick apart what was happening. Do you think that science journalists needed to kind of assert themselves and put themselves on the front page more? Are science journalists in some way more capable of, I don't know, communicating balance or complexity?
Yeah, I think that, part of the reason I really wanted to be a columnist and move from being a reporter to being a columnist, which is why I wrote that column about sex for the Inquirer, that was the only way I could become a columnist. But I think that having that ability to step back and put the week's or the month's news into context is really, really helpful. That when every headline has to sort of fight for eyeballs, then you can get a lot of hype in any area of science, and then in areas that involve health, you can get a lot of health scares, overblown or just wrong things. And so I think when it was better when we were trying to sell papers, and at least we were trying to sell people on the idea that they should trust us enough to get a long-term subscription to this paper. That's what was making money for us, was getting people to buy this long-term subscription, not to just click on individual headlines. Mm-hmm. And so once every headline's fighting for itself, I think that there is a tendency for the news to be distorted or oversimplified in ways that can drive people apart. And where, we've had this division of news where conservatives read one set of news sites and liberals read another, and they're emphasizing different things.
Now, in the book that you wrote those many years ago, you did talk a lot about evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, and I was wondering if you had any reason to think back then that the awareness of these disciplines would be as pervasive as they are now. I mean, it seems like, most people, these things have entered into the popular discourse, right? People talk about alphas, so forth. Some of the things that they were talking about, and it's a lot more mainstream, but it's also become a lot more political. I mean, it's always been political, right? I mean, Ed Wilson was, remember, famously dunked by activists,
Right.
but I mean, did you think that sex and gender would become as much of a political issue as it is now?
Not the way it went. It was political then, but this was 2000. I guess I started the column in 2005, 2006, and that the religious right was politicizing things. They were saying, I mean, we didn't have gay marriage then, and the religious right was still saying, oh, we shouldn't, even talk about people being gay or people being transgender or any of this. It's all a sin, and God doesn't want to. So it was politicized, but in a very different way, where you had the sort of voices of science, and then you had the religious side. Now you have people like Richard Dawkins on his site, arguing against the political left, saying, no, there really are two sexes. It's not a continuum. There are two sexes. That's the way biologists define it. You might not like it, but that's the way the world works. So things have rearranged themselves in a way that I don't think I would have predicted.
Right, and so it seems like the religious right has, at least in this domain, I mean, they're still active, right?
They're still active. They're still active, and yet there's some of the scientists have actually pushed back on kind of the extreme left, which is going beyond what the biologists would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you were to reactivate a column like that, do you think, I mean, that seems like a topic that never loses interest, right? People are always going to be interested in that.
It would be very interesting to try to go back and write that again, because we didn't have this fear that if you said something the wrong way, you'd be canceled, and it was all very clear cut at the time. You didn't have to worry you would say the wrong term for something. People who are not quite so oversensitive, now I feel like it just became very, very tense, and I think it'd be fun to write about it again, but I don't know whether it would work, or whether people would be upset. At the time, it seemed like the political divide was just in a different place from where it is now. Now things are definitely in flux again.
Well, I mean, that's certainly true in the general public, but what about in, say, the halls of academia? I mean, I always thought that academia was this place where if you're on campus, you have a certain license to explore and the capacity to debate and argue, shielded from the general public. But I mean, do you think that wall is breaking down? I mean, do you think that the science that happens inside the walls has become politicized in the way that it's been politicized outside the walls of academia?
Maybe. I mean, it's of course now everybody's got a blog, and everybody is connected to all of these academics are on Twitter or on X and Blue Sky, and so they're interacting with the public in a way.
They're doing their own journalism.
Yeah, and so that's something that's really changed since 2008. Now that now all these scientists, if they like social media, they're on it and they're arguing and they're hashing all these things out in the public.
Yeah, but I mean, what does that say what does that do to the role of the journalists? I mean, they can jump right into the fray and engage directly with the scientists and public.
I think that it's harder these days to sell the kind of story that I used to think was, that I still think is kind of the heart and soul of science journalism, which is to try to separate the science from the values, try to understand why people are disagreeing, try to understand where the science has evolved, where the science might have been wrong in the past. So even something like as fraught as whether sex is binary, I think at least in the past, that's something you could tackle as a journalist without taking sides, but just adding clarity and adding context and saying, these people disagree because they have different values and they want to use different language. They're interpreting things differently, but there's certain aspects of biology that everybody agrees on.
Now, I've talked to a number of faculty members at British universities who have these positions as professors of the public communication of science. Right? We don't really have anything like that in the U.S. Now, you spent some time at a university, but it was really about a short stint on journalism. I mean, do you think that we need to have more people in roles like that, people with scientific backgrounds who can get that kind of academic respectability for communicating with the general public?
I mean, I think there are people who do that, and they do a good job of it. And there are, some well-respected scientists who are out there with blogs, or they have their, TV series or some sort of a podcast. So, and I think that podcasting is one of the fun things about that is that you can hear people talk for a long period of time. So when they're interviewed in a story, there's a certain amount of translation, and you have short quotes, but you don't really get to hear them in depth talking about why they think what they do think, or why they disagree with somebody else. So no, I think that scientists who go public are doing a great service, but I think it's also can be pretty helpful to talk to journalists and help us understand things, especially when there's news and we're gonna write about it. And if we're gonna get everything right, we need to sit down and talk with those people that know what's going on, whether it's how vaccines work or what they know so far about how COVID is transmitted. It is really an important service that people do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, journalism is not a profession like law or medicine where you can get kicked out, right, for violating rules and norms. I mean, so how does the journalistic community sort of, I guess, protect the integrity of its product, right?
That's it. I think that it's changing so fast. When I was writing, when I was in the newspaper world, in some ways we were in the same newsroom with each other, and we had this obligation to get things right. It was just like the biggest, you felt like if I made a mistake in an article, I would be so upset I'd go out of the building and cry. I mean, it was just, you really, really, really didn't want to get something wrong, and you also wanted the pieces you wrote to go. They would go in a library somewhere where some sixth grader might read it and use it as a report. I mean, so it was just considered a really important duty to the public, to the honor of the paper you worked for, to get things right, and to get them right in a way that. Right, the sixth grader reading it like 3 years down the road, that it would still be right, and it would, and the sixth grader could understand it, which is sometimes takes more work than trying to make something that a few scientists understand. So there was, I think, a lot of just general sense of honor and honesty across the profession, that you wanted what you wrote to go into print and to and everybody was reading it. I don't know if it's the same way now that it's sort of, the whole profession is fractured and people are on Substack, they're on all these different platforms, and it's a different game, and I don't know if the rules have completely gelled yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think we in academia, we have a general sense of what the best journals are and what the less good journals are. We have a general sense of the good universities and the bad universities. And so I think most people in academia, they'll do like a preliminary ad hominem check, right? I mean, obviously you have to look at the papers and you look at the evidence and the data and the replicability and so forth. But a lot of people are like, oh, okay, this thing is published in, it's in Science, and these are a bunch of faculty members at MIT, so it's probably legit, right? Subject to disconfirmation. But in journalism, it's a little bit more difficult. I mean, I think it used to be the case that you were like, oh, if you're New York Times or Wall Street Journal, you're probably pretty good. There's some fact checkers that are probably checking this stuff. But now people get their news from Substack, or from anybody can become a journalist. So I mean, for the discriminating consumer of science journalism, I mean, how are they supposed to figure out, right, what they can trust and what they can't?
That's a good question, and I think in some ways it is hard to put blind trust in anything. You almost have to check a few sources, and I think if you look at a well constructed news article, it'll have different people quoted, and it'll have links to very specific papers, and it will link to what it says it's linking to. You have a lot of stuff that really is kind of fake news where there aren't any real people quoted, or it's just quoting, other journalists, and there are links and they're not going to what they say they're going to. A lot of people don't necessarily click the links. I was looking at a piece recently, about a very contentious issue, which is where COVID came from, whether it was a lab leak or an animal. And the scientists, who I think are really honest, will say, we think it's an animal, but we don't have enough data to know that for sure. And it is still possible it came from a lab. But a lot of people are now interpreting that to say, oh, they're all admitting there's a consensus it came from the lab, which I think is a stretch. And I saw that in a piece in the Free Press, and when I clicked on the link, there was a hyperlink to, this is now the consensus, and it went to a piece about one particular scientist who was making this case, and I thought, well, that doesn't really seem like a fair generalization to make because this one person said this. So I think it is harder to. You really have to evaluate the quality of an article by whether it's presenting a good balance of information. And
Right.
also, a lot of articles, I think now everything is so politicized that a lot of times things are presented in a way that's sort of seductively judgmental about people that disagree. I've seen this when I've looked at segments on Fox News on things I've covered, where the pundit or the host will say, well, only those stupid liberals would believe in this, and we smart people, we get why those egg-headed academics are full of it, and so it's a way of sort of pulling people in by flattering them, by insulting the other side. And you can see that in a subtle way sometimes in other kinds of news stories, especially around COVID, where it's very judgmental, those terrible people who didn't get their third booster shot, those terrible people who decided to stop wearing a mask, and so you do get, I think, a certain kind of judgment that people can find seductive because they're like, yeah, I'm in the good, smart, moral club, and I want to read about how terrible those other people are.
So it's become tribal, right?
It's tribal, yeah. It's become really tribal.
Yeah, and you wear your beliefs on your sleeve. I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard for me, even with my educated friends, to get in debates and discussions because the general tendency is to immediately think about what are the implications and the inferences and the assumptions and consequences that flow from a hypothesis or from a factual statement. I mean, it seems like that's just a product of impatience, right? I mean, do we need to teach people to be just a little bit more patient, maybe suspend their judgment a little more? I mean, that seems to me to be at the heart of the scientific way of looking at the world.
Yeah, and again, it's a chicken and egg problem. You can say it's people's fault that they want this stuff, or you can say journalists' fault that they're giving people this stuff, and each side can sort of defend themselves by saying, well, this is what we're reading, or this is the only thing we can sell people. But I think, yeah, that you could break the cycle on both sides.
Well, you had an article recently about deepfakes and about how they are proliferating, and not just fake images like the ones that we've all seen, but fake news, fake articles, fake scientific journals, fake data sets. I mean, it's becoming really easy to create fake stuff that looks really good. I mean, all the markers. I remember I used to teach a course where we talk about, fake handbags, and there'd always be some misspellings. Well, there's no misspellings anymore. I mean, that problem's been solved, and so how can we? I mean, to get on back to the idea of being discriminating consumers, it seems like this should create more demand for credentials. This should create more demand for certifications and authenticity. I mean, do you think that the periodicals and the reporters that can demonstrate that they are legitimate and reflective and balanced, I mean, will they ultimately be the ones that will kind of walk away with the choicest assignments, or will they ultimately be rendered irrelevant?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I don't see how an AI can go have a long talk with like 7 different experts and really weigh all that. But it can do some amazing things. And I guess it is really, it's sort of up to the public. Do they want articles that are written by an AI? Or do they want articles that are written by people? Or do they want both? Do they want maybe a combination of things? Now you get an AI answer at the top of a Google search. Is that what people want? I mean, sometimes I think it's annoying. Sometimes it can be kind of interesting to see.
I mean, I find that depending on how I prompt it, I get radically different answers.
Totally different, totally different. And in really important areas, like...
And I can get it to say whatever I want it to say, right? I mean, if I push it and say, are you sure? Now, wait a second. It's like, all right, never mind. Yeah, I'll give you the complete opposite point of view.
That's I think that's one of the hazards of AI, that people... It's so confident, it answers questions with so much confidence, and it sounds so smart that people just assume it's right. Mm-hmm. And it's often not right. People call them hallucinations, but it can just be, with some subtle thing in your prompt, right? I asked it about, somebody that was getting surgery, how long does it take to recover from this kind of surgery? And one way I asked it said like 6 weeks, and another way I asked it said 6 months. And it was the same question, and it was fairly serious medical advice it was giving, but it was giving really different answers. So I think there is going to be a period where people are sort of seduced into believing AI because it can be so incredibly smart, and it makes these statements with so much confidence, but that a lot of it, there is this kind of chaos to it. Little changes in the prompt will completely change the answer.
Yeah, I still have not yet found a substitute for the kind of heavy lifting that you have to do by reading all the different opinions and evaluating the credibility of the authors and checking the different resources. I would love to be in a position where I could just send Perplexity out and say, read all this stuff and come back.
Yeah, and come back to me, yeah.
Come back to me and tell me what actually seems convincing and makes sense, but we're not there yet.
No, we're not there yet. I wouldn't trust an AI to tell me, well, if I'm setting out on a story, well, what's the right answer here? I think I would. I mean, it would be interesting to see how it responded, but it probably again would respond differently depending on exactly how I prompted it.
And so, if somebody was thinking about a career in science journalism, I mean, what would you tell them? I mean, when you were studying undergrad at Caltech, I mean, I'm guessing you had no intention of being a journalist. Should we try to encourage people who are science majors to consider this as a career? I mean, because I know people who go to journalism school will think, okay, I can be a journalist. But I mean, most journalists don't start off as journalists. They start off as practitioners or scientists or something else. I mean, how do we sort of manage the funnel into this profession?
That's I think that it's a good thing that people start in different disciplines and find their way to journalism. I think in a lot of ways the ethics of science are very similar to the ethics of journalism, because you are trying, I mean, plagiarism is illegal in both cases. Making up data is that is the ultimate sin in both cases. I mean, you cannot make up data. You can misinterpret your data. There are human mistakes. You can miswrite something, but you can't make up data, and you can't copy somebody else's work and claim it's yours. And so there are some similarities in the ethics and the way things work, and the sort of challenges of getting to the bottom of things and to admitting to uncertainty. So I think that a background in science can be a great preparation for journalism. And it seems like people do find it, partly because there are different ways you just sort of get introduced to journalism. I was an intern, and I just thought, wow, what could be more fun than going up to investigate something new all the time and have this privilege of going to all these meetings, but getting to talk to everybody, ask any question I wanted, not worry about what the scientists thought of my question. The important thing was that I could extract information from them, and then you write your story, and then you can move on to some completely different story and investigate some new thing that you're curious about.
Yeah, maybe in another life, that would be something I could do. I love it. Thanks so much, Faye, for joining me. The old book is called The Score. It's still a lot of fun. Check it out. And also, your column at Bloomberg. It's probably worth the subscription just to have access to your column. Thanks
Well,
so
you
much
can
for
also
coming.
get it. I put them on. I'm still on Twitter and on Blue Sky, and I put them on as gift links, so you can read them for free if you follow me on social media.
Oh, wow. I wish I knew that. I just splurged
Yeah.
on a subscription to Bloomberg so I could read them all.
It's still worth it because we need the support. But I just found out how to do that. So this is like a new thing. I'm posting things with a gift subscription, so that way people can at least get, I think, some limited number of articles for free.
Well, we'll be sure to put that on the website. So thanks so much. We'll talk again soon.
Well, thank you. That was fun.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.